Hi, I'm Cory Booker. Thank you very much for tuning into this Facebook Live session with one of my, I'm not exaggerating when I say this is one of my life heroes, Bryan Stevenson. And we're here for our book club event for his incredible book, my best read in 2015, probably one of the best books I've read since I've been a senator, Just Mercy. Now, I just want to just give a little historical context here. Picture me as a young 20-something in law school, and I still say this. I always say the two best speakers, I won't even mention the second guy, but they came to law school and spoke. One of them was Bryan Stevenson, and I was hosting you. I was on the group that was hosting public interest lawyers to come in. And you gave a speech. I literally remember the stories you gave. That's how much they touched me. And probably some of the most precious minutes I had was walking you back to your hotel.
Right.
And I was such a fanboy. It was very embarrassing, but I did not want to let this man go upstairs and go to bed. But you are really a remarkable force for justice in this country, and I'm grateful that you're here.
Well, thank you. And I'm really excited to be sitting next to you, now a U.S. Senator, because I remember that trip to Yale, and I remember how passionate and enthusiastic you were and how you were struggling to find ways to make a difference. So it's a great honor for me to be sitting next to you, knowing all the extraordinary things you're doing and the incredibly important role that you're playing in this country. So it's really exciting to be back together.
And can we just list off at the top the things that you're engaged in right now that are important that you want people to know and how they can plug into that?
Sure. Well, we are still challenging abuse and excessive punishment in the American criminal justice system. We're still working to protect children prosecuted as adults. We won these cases at the Supreme Court, which have now banned mandatory life without parole sentences for all children and life without parole for all kids convicted of non-homicides. We actually just won the release of a man who'd been convicted of a non-homicide crime in Louisiana, and he spent 51 years at Angola's plantation prison. He just got out 2 weeks ago. So that work is moving forward. But we have two other areas that we're very concerned about. We think there needs to be a minimum age for trying children as adults in this country. There are 14 states that have no minimum age for trying a child as an adult. I have actually represented 10-year-old kids facing decades of adult incarceration because we don't have a minimum age. And so that's one of our big efforts, is to create a minimum age for all children, shielding them from the threat of adult prosecution. The second thing, critically important, is that we have on any given day 10,000 children, 17, 16, 15, 14-year-old kids housed in adult jails or prisons. And even though the Prison Rape Elimination Act prohibits that, there's no enforcement mechanism. So in about 28 states, kids are still being housed in these adult jails or prisons where they're at risk of sexual assault and abuse. So that's a big campaign we're pushing. We've got some other litigation campaigns. We really want to see the court create Eighth Amendment protections for people convicted of low-level drug crimes, subjected to these mandatory life without parole sentences. I think in just the same way that the court struck down mandatory life for juveniles, we should strike it down for people convicted of low-level drug possession. And then the other category is mental illness. I think it is cruel to condemn someone to die in prison with a mandatory scheme who is suffering from severe mental illness, and the judge can't consider that mental illness in imposing that sentence. So that's our criminal justice stuff, and then we've got a couple big race projects I'm also very excited about. We are building a museum in Montgomery called From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration. We really want to create spaces in America where we can begin to talk more honestly about our history of racial inequality. And we're also going to create a memorial that will be dedicated to the victims of lynching.
This is a profound idea, which I just found out about today.
It's astonishing to me in 2016, there's not a single place in America where you can go and have an honest experience with the history of lynching. There are very few places you can go and have an honest experience with the history of slavery. In Germany, you can't go anywhere in Berlin without seeing a marker or a stone that's been placed next to the home of a Jewish family that was abducted. Germans want you to go to Auschwitz and Birkenau and reflect soberly on that history. And because of that, they are recovering from the Holocaust. We don't distrust Germany. In South Africa, you can't spend time there without being confronted with the legacy of apartheid. But in this country, we don't talk about slavery, we don't talk about lynching, we don't talk about segregation, and I think we are burdened, we are compromised by our failure to confront that history.
And the worst period of domestic terrorism was that period after The fall of Reconstruction.
That's exactly right. From Reconstruction until World War II was an era of unprecedented racial terrorism. In fact, older people come up to me sometimes. They say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear somebody talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They say, we grew up with terrorism. And the trauma that terror created, I mean, most people don't realize that the demographic geography of this nation was shaped by racial terror. The black people in Newark, the black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland didn't go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They came to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. In 1910, 90% of the black population in this country lived in the South. And they fled by the millions during this period of terrorism and violence. And we haven't confronted it, we haven't talked about it. We have a project to put markers at every lynching site in America.
Which is amazing. First of all, my family has told stories when they were living in Detroit about helping families escaping out of fear, escape into Canada.
Yes.
But that's a powerful thing. And again, I didn't think I'd want to mention this because I didn't know what was going on. But and your standard to prove that a lynching actually happened, I was surprised was really high.
Very high.
Which you're going to explain the purposes for that for a second, but I just thought there's probably so many disappearances, questionable deaths that were happening during that period.
Tens of thousands. And in fact, we've uncovered this phenomenon of a near lynching. And that was the thing that, because we would interview people and they would talk about near lynching. And it'd be some mother who would say, my son came home and said, Mom, I bumped into a white man on the sidewalk. I ran into someone just trying to catch the train. And they'd call the family together and they'd have a conversation. They'd have to figure out, will a mob show up that night because of that incident, because of that very casual encounter? And the family would then decide it's not safe to stay. So they'd send the child away to Cleveland or Chicago or Detroit, never to come back. And it was these near lynchings that were just as devastating.
Right.
And there are tens of thousands of
How many more Emmett Tills would there be if people hadn't escaped?
That's exactly.
Now, the one point I want to make, which you're sort of touching on, is the fact that American history becomes greater when we talk about our dark corners.
Absolutely.
It becomes more vaunted, more revered. But when we homogenize or sanitize our history of all of these facts, I think it actually lessens us.
Well, we remain vulnerable to repeating those problems. I think there's a presumption of guilt and dangerousness that follows black and brown people in this country because we haven't made the kind of commitment, we haven't made the kind of response that we have to if we're going to recover from this history of racial inequality. And I think what you see in South Africa, what you see in Rwanda, what you see in Germany is an example of that. Those nations have made an effort to recover, not by denying the past, not by ignoring it, not by refusing to talk about it, but by confronting it. And we haven't done that, and we have to do that if we're going to be free. I don't think we're free in America. I think there's a smog created by our history of racial inequality, and we've been breathing it in. And it creates these tensions and this distrust and these barriers. And the reason why we're seeing this horrific police violence on the streets is because there is this presumption of dangerousness and guilt, and we're all infected by it. And until we begin to clean ourselves through this process of truth and reconciliation, until we change our behaviors, just like we have to in the environmental context.
And the powerful thing that you're saying, and again, I want to go in fast into this book because we're hitting on so many topics I want to come back to, and that even that we've got legislation, like the age at which children are presumed adults. We've introduced legislation here federally, but I just want to go through one point. So you have this understanding of implicit racial bias, which you just talked about, because I don't want people to be watching this and thinking this is a black-white thing. It is not.
No, that's right.
This is they find, even the head of the FBI, Comey, who's in the news obviously a lot, but he gave a powerful speech all about implicit racial bias. Such an honest, he was a Republican, white, I think Irish cop, telling the truth about implicit racial bias and how it affects black officers and white officers.
Everybody, and the thing about it is, when I talk about trying to get us to a different place, I'm not just talking about African Americans or people of color. I think we all want to be in this different place. We had a generation of people in this country that were taught that they are better than other people because they're white. And I think that's a kind of child abuse. And we haven't helped people recover from the narratives that they were being given. Oh, you can't go to school with those kids. You can't play with those kids. You can't be seen with those kids. And that kind of narrative has been so destructive. I was talking, one in my office was talking to me about a friend of hers, a white woman, who said that when she turned 16, she had to drop out of school so she could get a job, so they could have enough money to send her younger brothers to the all-white private academy when integration came. Because she said, in my county, if you were poor and white and you didn't go to the all-white private academy, you were nothing.
Wow.
And that dynamic, and that's another legacy of segregation and this animus that we have created in America, and we're all burdened by it, we're all impacted by it.
So I want to dive into the book because one of the things that surprised me, I'm a United States Senator, I've been working on criminal justice issues for a long time, since law school, and you kept blowing me away with facts I didn't know. And when I decided to write a book, I drew from some of the facts I pulled out of your book. And so I just want to march through some of those things you listed off. Children in the criminal justice system. You have a great chapter in here about women in the criminal justice system, mentally ill in the criminal justice. I just want to hit folks with some of the things he pulls out and ask you to comment on them. So this was something that got me about how children are treated in the criminal justice system. Now I already knew that we do things that other countries call torture, which is kids in solitary confinement, and that how the majority of suicides of children are kids that were kept in this environment that psychologists say is torturous to our children, and
particularly for young kids.
And how routine this practice is, I think, is what many Americans don't know. But what I want to go into is something that blew my mind, and it's amazing. As I listened to your book, I remember exactly where I was when certain things hit me. So I'm actually walking the National Mall as a senator, and I read about your brief, the amicus brief that Alan Simpson wrote, a fellow United States senator, about his childhood crimes, serious crimes. Here's what U.S. Senator Alan Simpson from Wyoming had spent 18 years in the Senate, including 10 as the Republican whip, the second-ranking senator in his party. He had also been a former juvenile felon, and his felons are shocking to me. He had been adjudicated as a juvenile delinquent when he was 17 for multiple convictions for arson, theft, aggravated assault, and I want to say that assault was on a police officer.
Yes, that's right.
Gun violence, and finally assaulting a police officer. He confessed, I was a monster. And so he was basically saying, I'm seeing kids in prison for long sentences.
That's right.
Decades for doing less than I was doing.
That's right.
And that was a powerful moment for me reading this chapter.
Well, things had changed so much. I mean, we had this era where we had criminologists going around the country saying that some kids aren't kids. They said that these are super predators, and we used this narrative to create this regime. And every state lowered the minimum age of trying children as adults, and we began putting kids. And today, if he had committed those same crimes, he wouldn't have had the opportunity to become a U.S. Senator, because we would have condemned him and warehoused him, likely for decades. And that's why we thought it was so powerful. I mean, I think that all children are children, no matter whether they've committed a crime, whether they haven't. And when we don't allow kids the chance to recover from adolescent mistakes, particularly kids that are vulnerable, we're doing something really indecent. I don't think you're a great society if you don't protect your most needy children, your most vulnerable children.
And so there's this powerful reality of the trauma to prison. Everybody knows about the school to prison pipeline, which is bad enough. And again, my team is working on things to try to deal with how minority kids or poor and minority kids are disproportionately affected by disciplinary. But what was getting me was that you are victims of trauma, untreated trauma, who then almost understandably, given the system as it is, end up in our prison systems as opposed to being treated and helping to become healthy.
And you know, the tragedy for me is that we know where these children are. We know there are zip codes in America where children are being born into violent families. They live in violent neighborhoods. They go to violent schools. They're surrounded by people who are shouting. They hear gunshots every night. No one is trying to keep them safe. And that means that by the time they're 5 or 6, they come to school with these trauma disorders. And the way you treat a trauma disorder with a child is the same way you treat it with a veteran. You try to create a relationship where they feel safe. And we're not doing that when they show up to school. We make them go through metal detectors, and then we have uniformed police officers threatening them with suspension and expulsion. And these children begin to make decisions that are bad decisions, but they are decisions that are inevitable when you're dealing with a trauma disorder. So they start joining gangs, or they start using drugs because they're looking for some release from that anxiety.
And we were talking as we were walking in today about the interventions are so much less expensive
incredibly.
when you can identify trauma amongst kids. So much more expensive than the damage they might do in their criminality, and the incredible cost to lock them up.
Absolutely. We've got states that are spending over $150,000 a year for a single child to keep them in a detention facility, and a fraction of that. Think what we could do with $30,000 a year per child for kids who are dealing with these trauma disorders. And there's no question, we've got good interventions, there are good strategies, there are good treatments. We just haven't employed them, and we need to. But we're not going to do it until we identify these children as disabled, as traumatized, like our vets.
Right.
And we denied PTSD for vets for a long
so
time.
that's where I want to. My staff is like waving at me because we're talking so much. But the other thing I want to say is like when those kids get into prison, it's not like we're having a sort of restorative justice in any way.
No.
We're taking this broken person and
Yes.
breaking them more,
Yes, that's right.
costing us more. But I definitely want to, first of all, the people on Facebook Live are just sending in great stuff. Read that quote because it's one of my favorite things to say that you've said.
The opposite of poverty is not wealth, the opposite of poverty is justice. Yeah, I really do believe that. I think, we talk too much about money in America, and if we talked more about justice, what would it take to create a just response to poverty, to disability, to people living in the margins, to homelessness, all of that, I think we'd make a lot more progress.
So let me race through some of these
Sure.
other issues, because you brought one of them up, which most people don't understand about our veterans in the system.
Yeah.
And you have a very powerful story about a veteran here, and I don't want to give too much of it away, but Herbert, it just reading this broke me.
Yeah.
But I just want to give some of the data. You said by the mid-1990s, nearly 20% of the people in our jails and prisons in the United States had served in the military. This is a story about a Vietnam veteran not getting the treatment, not getting the support. While the rate declined in the 90s, we were not in necessarily, as a shadow cast by Vietnam began to recede, you write, it has picked up again as a result of the military conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm seeing that.
Yeah.
And this is on my watch
Yes.
when I'm a United States Senator, to see the homelessness amongst our veterans, the mental illness amongst our veterans, how the very circumstances in which we place them have harmed them, and then what the response often they get here is the criminal justice system.
Yeah, it's really shameful that we have not recognized the damage that we do, the trauma we create, and then our failure to respond to that. And these men and women actually break my heart, and I talk about that man because he was a Vietnam vet. His whole unit was killed in a bomb. He was devastated by his time. He came back. He couldn't get the help he needed. He became involved in a very dependent relationship with a caretaker, which is not uncommon for trauma sufferers. And then when she couldn't really cope with him anymore, he followed her, and he did this foolish thing of putting a bomb on the porch to get her to come back to him. Got terrible representation, and I never will forget trying to stop his execution in the last few hours, and we weren't able to, and I went down to be with him on death row. It was the first time I stood with someone who was facing execution, and we were having this conversation. We were back before, right near the execution chamber. In those days, they used the electric chair, and he kept saying, he said, "Bryan, it's been such a strange day." He said, "When I woke up this morning, the guards came to me and said, 'What can we get you for breakfast?' He said, at midday they came to me and said, 'What can we get you for lunch?' In the evening they came to me and said, 'What can we get you for dinner?' He said, 'Bryan, it's been so strange. All day long people have been saying, 'What can I do to help you? Can I get you water? Can I get you coffee? Can I get you something to drink? Can we get you the phone? Can we get you stamps?' And I'll never forget that man saying to me, he said, 'Bryan, it's been so strange.' He said, 'More people have said, 'What can I do to help you?' in the last 14 hours of my life than they ever did in the first 25 years of my life.' And I couldn't help but think, holding that man's hands, yes, where were they when you were 3 and your mom died? Where were they when you started using drugs and alcohol as a teenager? Where were they when you came back from Vietnam, drug addicted and traumatized? I know where they were when you were accused of this crime. They were lined up to execute you, and they pulled that man away, shaved the hair off his body, put him in an electric chair, and executed him. And not only did I think that was shameful for him and for that state, I think it was shameful for America that we don't do better to protect the people who try to protect us. And there are so many people.
And the love with which you talk about everyone involved, the prison guards, everybody who's involved in this broken system, you extend compassion and love to everyone. I got to keep moving. This book is so full, so full. And this is something that you write, chapter 10, Americans' prisons have become warehouses for the mentally ill. Mass incarceration has been largely fueled by misguided drug policy, excessive sentencing, but the intermittent of hundreds of thousands of poor and mentally ill people has been a driving force. So by the 1990s, several states have had a deinstitutionalization rate of over 95%, meaning that for every 100 patients who had been residents in a state hospital before deinstitutionalization programs, fewer than 5 were residents. Basically, you go through you have powerful stories, but you interlace these truths that are painful as an American for me to read, that we basically deinstitutionalized the hospitals, which were people getting care, support, getting back on their feet, reintegrating, to the prisons, which they often are being more traumatized, not getting the support.
Yeah, we had this moment in American history where we thought that there was abuse, and there was abuse in these state mental institutions, and so we just shut them down without realizing that for the poor, we have to create an alternative system. And now that alternative system has become the criminal justice system, which is a worse place than the worst kind of state mental facility. And for me, it is cruel. If I saw someone who didn't have legs and somebody was trying to make them walk up the steps, I'd be very angry at that person, because that's a cruel thing to do. When we see people with physical disabilities, we want to help. We don't want them to be treated in a way that doesn't acknowledge that disability. But for mental disabilities, which we don't see, we're doing the exact same thing of trying to make people do things that they cannot do, and we're treating them cruelly. And our criminal justice system has been, in my judgment, the place where that cruelty has been most manifest. We have a whole nation full of poor people with severe mental illness and mental disability, and we are punishing them because they are sick.
So let me go to the last point, because I want to get to some questions.
Sure.
But the last one thing I want to read, I just want to give you this picture. So we're pushing here for criminal justice reform. Mm-hmm. We have allies like you, Van Jones. Mm-hmm. So Van was here doing an event. He brought Alicia Keys.
Oh, yeah.
Van brought a tremendous moment, packed room. I'm stalling because Alicia's a little late and getting ready. And I feel like, wait, we're getting some momentum. We're going to pass this bill. Everybody's I'm high. And then I remember I told one of my great leaders on my team here, because I got stopped. Yeah. This woman wanted to talk to me, and I'm like, I got Alicia Keys is coming. And she's like, no, I need to talk to you. Yeah. And she just laid into me about that often the way I present this is a male problem. Mm-hmm. She just broke down the data on women in the criminal justice system. And this book is powerful, but you did it in a way that just really educated me. And I want to read this whole page, but I'm not for time. But you talk about the most incarcerated women, nearly 2/3 are in prison for nonviolent, low-level drug crimes or property crimes. You then go about telling about this woman who, just to try to feed her kids, did some petty financial crimes. But you talk about the collateral consequences of incarcerating women are significant. 75 to 80% of incarcerated women are mothers with minor children. Right. Nearly 65% had minor children living with them at the time of the arrest. Children who have become more vulnerable, at risk. And then you go on to really hit Congress. Mm-hmm. Because you say in 1996, Congress passed welfare reform legislation that gratuitously included a provision that authorized states to ban people with drug convictions from public benefits and welfare. Yeah. This is like a couple pages I wish I could have gotten every one of my colleagues to read about what happens to children and these women.
Because I think you're right, it is really tragic, and it's core to some of the disintegration that we're seeing, particularly in poor communities. The percentage of women going to prison has increased 640% in the last 20 years, mostly for low-level drug crimes. They are, in some ways, the most vulnerable casualties of this misguided war on drugs. But we're doing things. I think we've created a new class of people in American society who are our untouchables.
Yes, you say that in the book.
And it came through with that legislation by banning people with drug convictions from public benefits, from public housing, from food stamps, from all of those things that we give to the poorest of the poor. By banning people with drug convictions, we basically said these people cannot be touched. And it's not just these people with convictions, it's these women with their children who've now been relegated to the margins, incapable of public benefit providers and direct service providers of helping. And it is, in my judgment, unjustifiable. States started pushing back against the federal statute and creating workarounds so they could still provide services, but we still have a bunch of states that didn't do that. And it's in those places where people are most vulnerable that we still have that class of untouchables. And it's one of the many things that I think we do need to change.
Okay, so we got to get to questions. I'm sorry. This is maybe self-indulgent, but I wanted to get through a lot of points.
Yeah.
Again, you got to read the book. You really, and by the way, listen to the book. That's what I did.
Yeah.
You beautifully read this book.
Thank you.
And you inhabit the characters. You almost as if you had some training because your accents are really spot on.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
It's really amazing. So I want to just go to some of the questions here. And I think the question that there was a lot of the similar question to the fact of, hey, like here's Heather Booth here in DC. She writes, what can non-lawyers do to address the systemic problems in the death penalty, juvenile detention, solitary confinement? Here is TJ Barker, just picked up the book. I'm only 20 pages into it, he writes, but I'm already asking, how can we make things better? How can a regular person get involved? And I'll finally give Tira Lindquist, who writes the same thing. This book changed my life. I'm with you. Really a life-changing book. I guess things I'd want him to address are around practical advice. Here we go. How do we build critical mass to make the sweeping changes we need? So all these folks want to know, they're not lawyers.
Yeah.
They just are people that you have pulled back the curtain, and now they're engaged, but they want to know what they can do.
Well, there's a lot you can do. I mean, I think the first thing is that you have to be ready to identify the politics of fear and anger that created mass incarceration. When you have politicians going around this country preaching fear and anger as a mechanism for progress, you need to resist that, because that's how we got into this mess. You can't create mass incarceration without a certain level of that politics of fear and anger, and we still hear that in the political discourse. That's number one. Number two, I think we all have a role to play in reaching out to this massive population that has now been impacted by mass incarceration. There are nearly 6 million people on probation or parole in America. Re-entry and how we support people, how we provide jobs, how we provide life skills, how we provide education and training and help to people coming out of jails and prisons is going to be the critical challenge of the 21st century. Even if we succeed in getting our legislation passed, there going to be hundreds of thousands of people coming out branded as a formerly incarcerated person. And anybody watching this podcast who's read the book can make a difference in the life of someone coming out of jail or prison. They need some. I had a client that's just like this man I just mentioned who got out after 51 years. He's never seen the internet. He's never seen a laptop. He's never seen an ATM. He doesn't know how to use a cell phone. And all of us are in a position to help people recover from this extensive isolation. They need life skills. You know, how do you fill out an online application? And there's a growing network of reentry providers that need volunteers. They don't have funding, but they can do the work if people volunteer and say, look, this is what I can do. I can help with literacy. I can help. We stopped educating people, so we need people to help with that. And then the third thing I think people can do is to kind of directly connect to the incarcerated. I hope in the next 10 years we're going to see volunteer programs taking on the challenge of rehabilitation for people in jails or prisons. It's already starting with some colleges who do great work.
Right, so find something to do. By the way, don't let your inability to do everything undermine your determination to do something.
That's exactly
right. Take one act.
That's right.
Remember, we are here because of the aggregated small acts of kindness, decency, and love by a lot of people.
Yeah.
So this is one I just want to mention again. This is something I'm trying to stop here. But this person, I was doing voter registration. I was really upset that I had several people tell me that they could not vote because of a past felony conviction.
Yeah. It's one of the most outrageous things we do. We want people to re-engage when they come out of jails or prisons, play by the rules, but then we don't allow them to participate in shaping those rules. President Obama came to Alabama in 2015 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. 80,000 people came. It was a great day, but very few people who came to Selma last year had any idea that today in Alabama, 30% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote as a result of these felon disenfranchisement laws. We need to change those laws.
1 out of 5 black people in Florida.
And 1 out of 5
black people in Florida can't vote.
It's really tragic.
For doing things the last 2 presidents.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And the question I have is, why don't we want to re-engage these communities of people? Where it's supposed to be a vaunted democracy, you're not a great democracy if you keep blocking people from participating in that democracy.
And that's where I appreciate, again, right and left, I hear Rand Paul said this to me, like, why are we taking away a person's fundamental rights for being caught with a small amount of drugs?
Right.
Let me give you this one, because I think it's a personal question.
Yeah.
Because I was blown away in the book, and we've been friends now for years, but the amount of physical intimidation you faced. And this person said, how do you remain motivated in the face of such animosity?
I feel that I am standing on the shoulders of so many people who did so much. I do have moments where I feel pretty overwhelmed, and I'll go into my office and I'll look out the window, and I'll just think about the fact that the people who are trying to do what I'm trying to do 60 years ago had to frequently say, "My head is bloody but not bowed," and I've never had to say that. My grandmother was the daughter of people who were enslaved, and she told me those stories about her father who had learned to read at the risk of death, at the risk of being sold. She told me about how they had to flee terrorism and lynching. My parents were humiliated every day of their lives by those signs that said white and colored. And when you have that history, that soundtrack in your head, you realize that you cannot be turned around by those who are angry, who are provoked, who are fearful. And you actually have to find a way to fight for them even as they are fighting against you, in the way that so many great people in our history have done. And so for me, I feel like I'm empowered, energized by all of that force of history that has put me in the place where I am.
Okay, so that was Amy Vaughn, and then Daniel Harrison sort of writes, talks again about the book. This was enlightening and a good read, but he just wants to know, are you hopeful? Are you optimistic about the future?
I am very hopeful, and I think we all have to be hopeful. I don't think we can make change if we do not protect our hopefulness. I'm really persuaded that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. I think we cannot make
That's powerful.
change.
Hopelessness is the enemy of justice.
That's right. Injustice persists where injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. We've got to stay hopeful because hopelessness.
Hold on, you running over these gems. Injustice prevails
where hopelessness persists. That our ability to end injustice is tied to our capacity to create hope. Hope is what gets you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is what gets you to speak when other people say be quiet. It's your hope that allows you to do things that are kind of against the trend, that are against the current. It's our willingness to believe things that we have not seen. I believe we're going to abolish the death penalty in this country. I believe that we can create race relations that are less fraught with distrust and ugliness and abuse and bigotry. I believe that we can reduce the prison population by 50% in the next decade.
And you had a meeting with Rosa Parks at the end where she what did she say to you?
And that's where I comes from. It was all about hope. I had the great privilege of meeting Rosa Parks, and I went over and listened to Rosa Parks, Johnny Carr, who was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott, and Virginia Durr, a white woman whose husband Clifford Durr represented Dr. King. And I listened to these women talk for 2 hours, and they didn't talk about the things they had done. In their 80s, they were talking about the things they were going to do.
That's awesome.
And it was a conversation so rich in hope. And I was just sitting there, and after a couple of hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, "Now, Bryan, tell me about the Equal Justice Initiative. Tell me what you're trying to do." And I looked over at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And so I gave her my rap. I said, "Well, we're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to end conditions of confinement. We're trying to do something about mass incarceration. We're trying to help children, the mentally ill. We're trying to do something about poverty and race." And I gave her my whole rap, and when I finished, she looked at me and she said, She said, "That's going to make you tired, tired, tired." And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, "That's why you've got to be brave, brave, brave." And their courage was rooted in a kind of hopefulness that we have to have. When I see people getting hopeless about what they can do, I see them as kind of part of the problem. You've got to protect yourself from the things that make you hopeless, because that's the only way we're going to make a difference. And so, yes, I am very, very hopeful right now, very excited about what we can do in this country.
And that hope and that bravery, that courage, I always say that cynicism is a refuge for cowards.
Yes.
Now my staff is trying to tell me to wrap up, but I'm going to try to assert that I might have some kind of power here. I mean, let's call this Booker Book Club overtime.
I like it.
Because there's two more things I want to do and say, because the beauty of this book to me is your unconditional love you have for everyone. Yeah. You're not just looking at the condemned, the vulnerable, the voiceless, which alone, that would be enough to motivate my reverence for you. Yeah. But then you extend it to others. Yeah. There's two things I want to do. One is just go to that moment where you were standing up for a man convicted of murder. He's now taken away in shackles, and you turn around and you're tired, you're walking out of the courtroom, and there are three women sitting there who were the victims.
Yes.
And we often don't talk about the victims
That's
of
right.
crime in this country,
Right.
and how this system isn't working for them either.
Yeah.
That was a powerful moment for me.
Sure. Yeah, no, I was leaving the courtroom, and there in the back with this group of women and a couple of children, and they came over to me, and it was the mother of the child who had been murdered, and it was the sister. And they were grieving, and they said, we'd been promised all these things and we didn't get them. And I was taken aback because they said, can you help us? They'd heard me in there arguing for the defendant. And I sat down with them and we started talking, and there is this need to recognize the true needs, because this is a hierarchy. We have a hierarchy in our criminal justice system. I think our system treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And there's a similar hierarchy around victimization. And affluent victims and sometimes victims who have a lot of support in the community get attention that poor victims don't. And I think we've got to change that. My grandfather was murdered when I was 16 years old. And there's a pain and an anguish that comes with this victimization that we experience too often in America. But we have to change our relationship. We have to actually start thinking, well, what do these communities need? What do you need to recover? And a lot of times it's not vengeance. It's actually comfort. It's actually support. It's actually economic help. And that's what I experienced when I interacted with those people. And I do feel that. I do feel like, we're not going to create justice if we only focus on the accused, if we only focused on the person who's being tried. We have to focus on the entire system and all of the people who are contributing to that justice.
And so think about this system we have that's costing us billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah.
You said it yourself that we were building a new prison every 10, 11, 12 days, but yet that victim of a crime is not getting restitution, is not getting restorative justice. Our society wants to pay more and more for these disproportionate sentences, but leave that victim, often poor themselves.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, the victims of crime in my community where I live, I see around my state, there aren't systems of support.
No.
And what you said, and I wept at Newtown. It was, I still think about it and I want to weep. But I saw the kind of resources that were marshaled around. But yet there were kids in other communities, victims of similar traumas in terms of seeing shootings, in terms of seeing violent crime, in terms of seeing horrific scenes. And yet they don't get that kind of support as victims themselves.
No, and it's heartbreaking because I work with mothers who have lost children to gun violence and who have lost children to the criminal justice system. She's got children in prison and children who are the victims of murder and assault. And we are not recognizing their victimization. We're not holding those communities. We're not responding to their needs. And one of the things that we have to do is to break down this disconnect that you're either an offender or a victim.
Yes.
I don't think that works for any of us. We all offend.
Yes.
And we've all been hurt. And that's why I say I think we are all more than the worst thing that we've ever done.
I love that I've tweeted that out more than you know.
That's the thesis, really. I think if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if someone takes something, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And we can't do justice until we know the other things you are.
So don't take away, because I wanted to end on a note from the book that you're getting close to. But I just want to. I can't end this conversation when we are now at another point, yet another point in our country where we've had two people now, two horrific, one in Louisiana, one in St. Paul, I think, police-involved shootings. I want to get your thoughts on that in general, but I also want to take you to a moment, because you're a man of sort of Mandela-like love, that sees the jailer, like Mandela did, with the same sort of compassion as people often that are jailed. Because I want to just put this note in you, that in your head, that I had a powerful moment with the Obama's 21st century policing task force, and they shook me with the truth, because I had to run a police department and I saw what a lot of these officers go through, that they go through traumatic events and then they go home and there's no support for them. And they found out that incident where that officer sat on a 14-year-old teenager at a pool party, that we all saw the video for, and it made me so angry. What they were doing to one of our children, whether you're black, white, whatever, that is our child. And they told me that one of the indices they had for police officers, they started seeing with big data, they could start seeing what some of the indices of which a police officer might have a break like that and do something. were them being involved in suicides.
Yeah.
And the trauma and the stress from that often makes them ready to snap.
That's right.
And so I want to ask you this question about these horrific shootings that are now being investigated, at least the one in Louisiana by the DOJ. But for you, as somebody who I so revere in your ability to see the world and knows, we talked a little bit off camera about all the beatings and the abuse that sometimes that historically has gone on in prisons, all the violence, the dehumanization of prisoners. I come from Stanford, where they did that famous prison project, where they turned Stanford students just by putting them in that context. Through a make-believe thing, horrific things happened. They had to cut the experiment because of the dehumanization that suddenly went on. But in all of that context, I just want to know if you have anything to say about these shootings that now seem, I don't think they're becoming more frequent.
No, that's right. That's exactly right.
We just have video.
That's right. We have technology now that we can capture more of them. I think we have to fundamentally change the identity of policing and police officers in this country. We have too many police officers who think of themselves as warriors. And they've come back sometimes from military service with this attitude where they see the community and the people in the community as the enemy. And we do not need people armed on our streets, working for the government, who see themselves as warriors. We need people who see themselves as guardians. And a good guardian takes care of everybody, including the guy who's just committed a crime. And they have to see taking care of that person as the same kind of priority as taking care of the person who might have been a victim. And that guardian mindset changes the identity. You're not reaching for the gun. And good guardian police departments aren't going to have their officers going to training that is 90% shooting and fighting. Because if that's all you train for, that's what you're going to do. What we're going to begin to do is to train those officers on how to interact with people who are disabled, interact with people who are dealing with drug addiction and drug dependency. And we have to change the culture of policing, not just because the communities need that to be safe, but police officers need that too. Because you're angry and you're not happy and you feel antagonized all the time. If you see the community as the enemy, they're not your enemy. They're actually the people you're supposed to care for. They're the people you need to take care of. And when you create a relationship of guardian and caregiver, when you really do protect and serve, everybody does better. I was in Sweden trying to adjust to the time. I just flew in, and I was walking around, and no one speaks Swedish, and I watched this encounter between a mother and her children and a police officer. I thought something bad was about to happen, and I watched this woman go up to the police officer, gesture, and then she went into a store, and what she was doing was asking the police officer to watch her kids while she went into the store and buy some things, and the police officer started playing with the kids. Woman came out, she thanked the police officer, the kids thanked the police officer. When we have relationships like that, then we can.
And by the way, that was a teaching moment for those kids.
Yes, it was. Everybody, and it was one for me because I could see this possibility of someone in the streets actually. So we've got to create that culture. But then the other thing we've got to do is we have to create accountability. Many of the things that we're seeing now is because we've had decades of police abuse and misconduct with no accountability. And people have actually been acculturated into thinking that that's what you do when you're in a really stressed situation.
And I have a whole chapter in my book. That's one of the subtitles about accountability, lessons I learned. And the other thing I want to make before I go to my closing here is, as a guy who was running a police department, which didn't have systems of accountability like we should have, and I worked at the end of my time as mayor to try to work with the ACLU to get them, what bothered me is that there's so much money being spent on warehousing human beings, but a lot of the things that would help local police departments do more community policing, have officers that can do a lot of this engagement. We were cash strapped. New Jersey cities were just laying off police officers, not investing in the kind of things that would have made healthy, robust relationships. We know what works.
Yes, that's right.
But we're not doing it.
But that's the tragedy. We went from $6 billion on jails and prisons in 1980 to $80 billion last year. And we could bring down the prison population by half. Then we'd have $40 billion to actually invest in public safety. Think what we could do if we actually created funds to help police officers develop the skill set so they could get that implicit bias training, so they could actually learn and develop higher emotional IQ in problem solving. If we could provide them with the support and resources they need to help be those good guardians. And we have the money, but we're squandering it by putting people in prison for decades because they write a bad check, because they've been in possession of marijuana, because they shoplifted a candy bar. and now we're going to spend $30,000 a year to keep them in prison for 40 years. We are squandering the money that we should be spending on public safety.
So there's a part here that I just thought, there's a number of parts, a number of chapters.
Yeah.
I think it's like, I use the word poetry, maybe not in the traditional sense, but the way you write these prose spoke so much to me, because I do believe courageous empathy is what we need. And that even our founders, even though they wrote these documents when they called Native Americans savages and the African Americans were fractions of human beings, women weren't mentioned at all, but there was a genius in their understanding of the interdependency that is going to be necessary to make this country great. And they knew they had to almost sacrifice self, their own egos, bond with their fellow Americans to make this country go far. And that's that old African saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Patriotism, I try to remind people all the time, is about love. And love of country necessitates loving your countryman, countrywoman. And extraordinary love makes allowances. And the beautiful motivation for the title of this book to me was this eloquence that you write that I must have replayed 10 times, just stopped, rewound, about you're talking about this idea of mercy being unmerited. You and I are sinners. We've done things that were wrong. Most of my friends can say, thank God that they didn't catch me. We wouldn't have President Bush or President Obama.
That's right.
If they had been treated like our system treats poor people now.
That's right.
And so who is worthy of Alan Simpson, who we discussed before, if he hadn't seen mercy, if he hadn't been the beneficiary of grace.
That's right.
These are concepts you talk about so beautifully. But the one I want to read to conclude, because my time as mayor, I grew up in a very privileged environment. Moved in my 20s. I wanted to move. Ironically, the street was Martin Luther King Boulevard, but it was a very violent street, even though it was named for the man that stood for nonviolence. And I saw things that I had, and experienced things that I had never witnessed before. But at the same time, amidst all of that, I saw some of the greatest Americans that I could ever imagine, who showed such courageous love amidst hostile conditions, elevated a level of genius in their loving that inspires and sustains me to this day. I have entire chapters in my book dedicated to some of these people. But when you wrote this, it so moved me, and I just want to read it and then let you have sort of some concluding reaction to what you wrote. But you talk about Thomas Merton, and you say this great thinker said, we are bodies of broken bones. And then you say, I guess I'd always known but never fully considered that being broken is what makes us human. We all have our reasons. Sometimes we're fractured by the choices we make. Sometimes we're shattered by things we would never have chosen. But our brokenness is also the source of our common humanity, the basis for our shared search for comfort, meaning, and healing. Our shared vulnerability and imperfection nurtures and sustains our capacity for compassion. You write that you had this realization. I realize that they were broken people too, even if they would never admit it. You're talking about society as a whole. So many of us have become afraid and angry. We've become so fearful and vengeful that we've thrown away children, discarded the disabled, and sanctioned the imprisonment of the sick and the weak, stemming from our anger and our hurt. Not because they were a threat to public safety do we do these things, or beyond rehabilitation, but because we think it makes us seem tough and less broken when we punish these people. I thought of the victim of the violent crime and the survivors of murdered loved ones, and how we've pressured them to recycle their pain and anguish and give it back to the offenders we prosecute. I thought of the many ways we've legalized vengeance and cruel punishments, how we've allowed our victimization to justify the victimizing of others. We've submitted to the harsh instinct to crush those among us whose brokenness is most visible. But simply punishing the broken, walking away from them, or hiding them from our sight, only ensures that they remain broken. And we do too. There is no wholeness outside of our reciprocal humanity.
Yeah. I really do believe that when we begin to understand that when we give something to people who deserve it, it's not mercy. When we show compassion to people who deserve it, we're not really showing mercy. Mercy is what we give to people who don't deserve. It's in that dynamic. And for me, it took me a while, but I realized that I represent the broken. All of my clients are broken people. They've been broken by disability. They've been broken by abuse. They've been broken by despair. They've been broken by drug addiction. And I work in a broken system. The people who have power are unwilling to get close to these communities. They're hopeless. They're rooted in fear and anger. And that broken system makes it very difficult. And there have been times when I've gotten overwhelmed and I've had to ask, well, why do you do what you do? And I had a moment after an execution where I just felt like, you know what, I can't do this anymore. It was so painful. This man was disabled. He was stuttering. He couldn't get his words out. And they pulled him away and they executed him. And I was so overwhelmed by it. And I started thinking about maybe I should do something else. And then I sat down and I thought about it for a while. And then I realized something I'd never realized before. And what I realized is why I do what I do. And when I realized that I don't do what I do because it's about justice. I don't do what I do because I've been trained as an attorney. I don't do what I do because if I don't do it, no one will. I don't do what I do because I think it's important. I realized that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth is that when you get proximate, when you live in those kind of communities, when you see those things, when you have to kind of keep pushing to change narratives and to stay hopeful, when you do uncomfortable things in service of justice, it will break you. But I also realize that there's power in brokenness. It is the broken that teach us the way compassion works. It's the broken that can show us the way justice works. It's in broken communities that we see that kind of transcendent love, that kind of mercy that will inspire a community to stand up, a nation to stand up. And it is in our brokenness that we actually have the opportunity to connect with our humanness in the most profound way. You show me a loving couple that's been together 50 years, I'll show you two people who have learned how to say I'm sorry to one another, who learn how to manage the fragility of the other, the brokenness of the other, to embrace that. And that's why this broken history we have of inequality and injustice isn't something we should deny. It's something we should confront. And when we begin to confront it, I actually think we can begin to recover. I tell this story, I'll do it quickly. I was giving a talk in a church, and an old man came into the back of the church, and he was sitting in a wheelchair. And I got through the talk, but he was staring at me hard the whole time. And when everybody else left, he came up in his wheelchair, and he came in front of me, and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I just stood there, and he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I mumbled something. Then he asked me one more time. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" Then he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And this older man looked at me and he said, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." And I was really moved. And then this man said, "Come here, come here, come here." And he grabbed me by my jacket, pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, "I'm going to show you something." And he turned his head. He said, "You see this scar I have behind my right ear?" He said, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this cut I have down here at the bottom of my neck?" So I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote." And then this man looked at me. He said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man. People look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But these aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And it is in those broken spaces that that man has honored himself by being someone who stood and fought and did the right thing. And so for me, it is critical that we reflect on our brokenness and begin to embrace the broken around us, help the broken around us, restore the broken around us. And that's how we'll recover from our brokenness too.
So, for the people who know me, know I love manifestations of faith. I love how people see the divine. And I've studied Judaism a lot. I've studied Hinduism and Islam. But allow me to end with this moment, because I stood up straight when I read this part, and I'll end with this last thing. I promise. I know we've gone over time, but we share a lot in common. We're both follically challenged.
Yes, indeed.
I feel that, one thing we share in common is we both are young men who grew up in the church.
Yes.
And it was a beautiful moment in your book when someone's being led, and it's almost painful for me to say it was a beautiful moment, but someone's being led to execution, and you're singing Broken Cross. But I bring this up because in our faith tradition, and we actually grew up not only in the Christian church, but probably in a black church.
Yes, right.
Which is, you hear lots of moaning and shared pain.
That's right.
But there's a moment in the book where you talk about, this is where I stood up straight, I felt, where you tell the story of Jesus before a woman who's being stoned.
Yeah.
And it's a story everyone knows as a Christian.
Right.
But the question is do we live by that?
Yeah.
And Jesus says, the parable, he says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone.
That's right.
And in the book, you had this metaphor where, and you were having a conversation, I think, if I remember the story correctly, where you talk about these stones being thrown, a society where 1 out of 10 of us today are breaking, 1 out of 10 Americans today will break a drug law.
Yeah.
And yet we have more people in jail today for nonviolent drug crimes than all the people in jail in 1975.
Right.
And you use this metaphor that about, I guess I'm going to have to be a stone catcher. I'm going to have to stand up as these stones are being hurled and be a stone catcher.
That's right.
We are a society where we need more stone catchers.
I think that's right. I mean, it's not enough anymore to read that scripture or to have a construct of that story, to have an understanding of that story. We actually have to act. We actually have to stand in front of the people who are being targeted with these stones, who are being judged unfairly, who are being treated unfairly. And for me, to be a person of faith, to be a person who cares, in this century, at this time, it is not enough to be in sacred, protected, quiet places. You've got to go in loud, difficult places, and you've got to act. You've got to represent. You've got to witness. You've got to catch these cast stones. And in so doing, there are moments where you feel some of that pain, but more than anything, there are moments where you understand the power of being a witness, of being committed to something bigger and better than the hate and the abuse and the incarceration that has so defined too many of our communities.
I feel like when I close this book, that I feel full, and I feel even more committed to making us move from a society of a prodigious punishment to one of proportionality, from retribution to restorative justice. I believe that one day we will have a criminal justice system that reflects our highest values, that heals, that restores, that is just. And I want to thank you for teaching me. You are never had you as a professor, but you are definitely a wise teacher amongst us. And the beautiful thing about you is that you teach through what you do, how you live, and the energy that you are exploding into this world. I just thank you for your love, man, and I thank you that you are indiscriminate in your loving, and thank you for lifting me.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you. All right, thank you, everybody. I don't know what book we're going to do next. It's going to be. He had a couple of recommendations off camera that maybe we'll explore. But I want to thank everybody for this very long book club session. I hope it touched you in the way it touched me. And I hope that if you want to find out more about Bryan Stevenson, just Google him. He's doing a lot of things that you could help. Maybe you can't give $1 million, but you can give $2. Maybe you can't do anything for him where he is working, but you can learn about it and do something for us as a country where you are. Explore him, read the book if you haven't read it, listen to it on book tape. He reads it powerfully, but make sure that you don't remain the same. Nothing will change unless you do. Thank you very much.